Well, today, after a bit of a long break, I've decided to restart the Open News, so expect new weekly episodes of the Open News. So with that said, hello and welcome to the Open News, the show that covers all things tech and open source. Today we're going to be covering the following news stories. Alt-right social media site Gab hacked, RPMFusion retires Telegram desktop, Steam Link is now available as a Linux app, Ubuntu 21.04 will include some Gnome 40 apps, and there's been updates to lots of popular Linux software. We're going to be talking about all of that and more right now on the Open News. If you enjoyed this video, consider joining Odyssey, the freedom-respecting alternative to YouTube. Links in the description. For our first news story, we have this. Gab, the far-right internet refuge, has been hacked. Indeed, it would seem one of the biggest alt-right social media sites on the internet has been hacked and the private data of its users has been leaked. Apparently, the hackers managed to leak over 70 gigabytes worth of data, which includes public posts, private posts, user profiles, and in some instances even what appear to be plain text passwords. Apparently they may have also leaked account information that belonged to former President Donald Trump, but for some reason I doubt that Trump has a Gab account. Now, you might be wondering, what have Gab done in response to the report that they've been hacked? Well, the absolute worst thing that any company can do, of course. They flat out denied it and accused the reporters that were reporting on the hack of smearing them, which is nonsense, and given the fact that Parler recently got hacked, it would seem highly likely that Gab would be a target of hacking too. Now, luckily for Gab users whose data was leaked, the hackers haven't released the data that they've hacked publicly. Instead, they're releasing it with parties that they describe as having a proven track record of doing research in public interest. So that's likely going to mean journalists and social scientists. Presumably, the motive of these hackers is to expose bigotry, racism, and other general alt-right nastiness that happens on Gab. And if you were using the platform for mundane things, presumably you have nothing to fear from this data breach. Hopefully the data that this hack has led to gathering does some public good, even though maybe the method of gathering this data wasn't the most ethical. Now, I'm going to be honest, in my view, most of what happens on Gab is completely reprehensible. But with that said though, if this sort of thing can happen to them, it can happen to anyone. So make sure that you are practicing good online security. When you're joining a site, make absolutely sure to use a completely unique password for it, and if you're doing something overtly political, it may even be worth using a separate burner email for the account, just in case a data breach should happen. And that's something that should apply to everyone from all ends of the political spectrum. But with that said, let's move on to a more pleasant topic than talking about alt-right websites. For our next story, we have this. RPMFusion retires Telegram desktop. Now, for those who don't know, RPMFusion is a very popular third-party software repository for Fedora that has loads of packages that the Fedora team either don't or won't include by default in the default Fedora repositories. And Telegram is a popular open-source messaging app. Sadly, it would seem that if you use Fedora and Telegram, you might be a little bit out of luck though, since the maintainer of the Telegram desktop on RPMFusion recently announced that they'd no longer be building the package due to the fact that Upstream is, according to them, very hostile to Linux package maintainers. Now, I couldn't tell you how true that is, but it's a huge shame that a massively popular distribution will no longer have Telegram easily available for it because of how the Telegram team handles the way that people build packages for GNU/Linux. But I suppose it's up to the package maintainers to decide what they do and don't want to package. I just hope that other package maintainers don't follow along with what Fedora and RPMFusion are doing, since Telegram is a really useful program for getting people off Facebook Messenger and other services like that. For our next news story, we have some great news for any PC gamers out there. Steam Link is now available on Linux to stream your games from any PC. So hey, anyone remember those Steam Link things that used to be able to plug into your TV and use to stream games from Steam? No? Well, they're now a Flatpak app that you can install on any Linux distribution. I can see this as being useful to people who want to stream games to any lower end hardware that they might have. I can also see this being useful to people who keep around a Windows PC just to play games that aren't supported on Linux, because now you can stream them to your Linux PC with a convenient app. So all in all, this new Steam Link app seems pretty useful and I can't wait to give it a try. Next up, we have some news about the upcoming Ubuntu 21.04. Looks like Ubuntu 21.04 will offer a hybrid GNOME 3.38 desktop with GNOME 40 apps. So a lot of you might already know that Ubuntu 21.04 sadly won't be shipping with GNOME 40 due to the fact it's just such a big update over GNOME 3.38, which means that the Ubuntu team needs more time to test everything and make sure that GNOME 40 works fine with all of Ubuntu's tweaks. However, it would seem that that doesn't mean that Ubuntu users will be excluded from all of the GNOME 40 goodness, because Ubuntu 21.04 will actually come with several apps from GNOME 40. As far as we can tell, the following apps will be using the updated GNOME 40 versions: the GNOME Calculator, Disk Usage Analyzer, Disk Utility, Evan's Document Viewer, Eye of GNOME, GNOME System Monitor, Seahorse, which is a password and key manager, GNOME Sudoku, GNOME Characters, GNOME Help, and GVFS. You can also optionally install the updated Evolution email client, Evolution Data Server, GNOME Clocks, GNOME Robot, the Epiphany web browser, GNOME boxes, and more to be added possibly in the future. So essentially, Ubuntu 21.04 will include an odd mixture of GNOME 3.38 and GNOME 40, with the desktop and its most important components stuck at GNOME 3.38, but with many GNOME applications using their GNOME 40 versions with all of the new features that provides. So all in all, it's a bit of a shame that Ubuntu 21.04 won't be getting GNOME 40, but it is still nice to see that Ubuntu users will still be getting some of that GNOME 40 goodness. And finally, to finish us off for this week, I just want to go over some popular Linux software that's been updated this week. Both KDE Desktop and Mobile have been updated this week, with updates to KDE Mobile bringing lots of UI and app improvements, which should be great news for any current or future PinePhone owners out there. The update to KDE's Desktop for this week includes updates to a variety of apps, as well as improvements to system settings, key repeat being enabled by default, and various other bug fixes. Additionally, popular Office suite LibreOffice has received a variety of fixes, features, and improvements this week. Some highlights include a new user interface flavor selector at startup, a new extensions downloader, and most importantly to me, as someone who sadly has to work with proprietary documents a lot, improved interoperability with proprietary documents, although I should probably warn you that this release of LibreOffice is the community edition, which is considered bleeding edge. If you do serious work in LibreOffice, or if you're an enterprise user, consider sticking with a more stable version of the software. And with that said, that's it for today's episode of the Open News. That's all the news we have time for this week. I hope you enjoyed watching, and I will see you again next week for another episode of the Open News. Thanks for watching.